It was an ordinary day at the prestigious bank, and the manager was already deep into his routine. The bank, located in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods, catered to its well-to-do clients, offering premium services and exclusive treatment. It wasn't every day that someone came in with a check for such a large amount, and for the bank manager, this was just another day at work, nothing special. The door opened with a soft chime, and a woman stepped inside. She walked with a quiet confidence, dressed in a professional but understated outfit. Her suit was sharp, her demeanor calm, and her face showed no signs of stress or urgency. She was a woman in control, but the bank manager didn't notice that. All he saw was another customer, just like the rest. As she approached the counter, the manager didn't think much of it at first. He greeted her with a smile that was almost robotic. "How can I help you today?" he asked, already turning to face his computer screen. His voice carried the tone of someone who had said the same words countless times before. It was nothing personal. It was just the job. "I'd like to cash this check," the woman replied, holding out a large check for a significant amount of money. She placed it on the counter, confident in her request, expecting this to be a simple transaction. The manager glanced down at the check. It was a standard form, nothing out of the ordinary. But as his eyes scanned the details, something in his mind clicked. The check was much larger than usual, and he instinctively raised an eyebrow. He paused, just for a moment, to take in the numbers. This wasn't the kind of transaction he dealt with every day. He had seen checks of this size before, but there was always a part of him that questioned such large sums. He looked up at the woman, studying her now with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Her appearance didn't match what he expected from someone holding a check like this. She wasn't dressed in a way that screamed wealth or power. No extravagant jewelry, no high-end designer labels. It was as if she was purposefully downplaying her status, and that made him even more wary. Without giving it much thought, the manager's assumptions led him to believe this wasn't quite right. Maybe it was a mistake, or maybe something about the situation just didn't sit well with him. "I'm going to need to verify this," he said in a tone that was somewhat dismissive, as if it was just another small inconvenience. He didn't consider how he was making her feel in that moment. Instead, he began to type into his system, checking all the security protocols, running the check through the usual verification process. The woman stood there, calmly watching him work. She hadn't shown any sign of frustration or impatience, as many customers might. Her hands were folded in front of her, her eyes trained on him with a faint smile, but it was the kind of smile that suggested she knew something he didn't. She was in no rush. There was no need for her to hurry. She knew how this would play out. For the manager, however, this was just another routine procedure. He was convinced the check was something that needed to be questioned, even if he couldn't fully explain why. He continued typing, going through every little detail on the check, making sure everything was just right. His thoughts were more about policy than about understanding the woman standing before him. Little did he know, he had just made a huge mistake. The bank manager's fingers tapped the keyboard, his mind racing through the routine steps of verifying the check. He glanced at the woman again, still standing there with a calm demeanor, as if this moment was nothing more than a minor inconvenience to her. He couldn't help but feel slightly uncomfortable, even though he didn't quite understand why. Something about the situation was bothering him, but he pushed the feeling aside. He examined the check more closely, looking for any signs of fraud or error. The amount was large, yes, but nothing about the check seemed outwardly suspicious. Everything was in order. The dates matched, the account number was correct, and the signatures were clear. Still, something felt off in the back of his mind. He glanced back at the woman, then at the check, and back again. His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. Without making eye contact, he began speaking again, his voice more formal this time, as though his professionalism would mask any of the discomfort that was creeping in. "I'm going to need to verify a few things with our home office," he said, the words falling from his mouth almost automatically. He knew that people sometimes tried to take advantage of banks with large checks, and he assumed this might be one of those cases. The woman nodded, but there was no sign of impatience in her eyes. She didn't look bothered, as most people would have in a similar situation. Instead, she remained perfectly still, her gaze steady as she watched the manager continue his work. She wasn't in a hurry, and she wasn't fazed. She knew this was only the beginning of what was to come. The manager continued to tap away at his computer, almost mechanically now. He started to input the check's details into the bank's security system, but despite everything seeming normal, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. He glanced at the woman again, trying to read her, but all he saw was calm confidence. She hadn't asked any questions. She wasn't pushing him to hurry. It was as if she already knew how this would go. "Just a minute," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her. He picked up the phone and dialed the number to the home office, his voice more clipped now, as though the uncertainty of the situation was beginning to take its toll. The ringing on the other end of the line sounded almost too loud in the quiet space of the bank. The woman stood there, unmoving, but her presence seemed to fill the room. She watched the manager, her expression unreadable, but it was clear she wasn't concerned. He seemed increasingly agitated with every moment that passed, but she remained calm, knowing full well that his discomfort was only just beginning. The manager's conversation with the home office didn't last long. After a few minutes, he hung up, the line cutting off with a soft click. He sat back in his chair, looking at the woman again. There was no denying the awkwardness of the situation now. He had made her wait for longer than he should have, and he knew that the longer this dragged on, the more his initial assumptions would come to light. Finally, he broke the silence. "I'm going to have to take a closer look at this," he said, his voice still tense, but less certain than before. He tried to sound professional, but the unease in his tone was unmistakable. He glanced at the check again, unsure whether it was the woman or the situation that was throwing him off. But as the minutes ticked by, he had no idea just how far off he was. The bank manager sat there, staring at the check with growing uncertainty. It was as if something about this situation was steadily gnawing at him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He glanced at the woman again, her composure standing in stark contrast to his own growing frustration. There was something calm about her, almost as though she had been through this kind of thing before and wasn't at all worried by the delay. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something. The check itself looked fine, but there was something about the whole situation that didn't seem right. He briefly wondered if she was trying to pull something over on him, though he quickly pushed the thought away. That wasn't like him. He was thorough, careful, and always followed the procedures. But in the back of his mind, doubt still lingered. He'd worked in the bank for years and seen all sorts of transactions, but nothing quite like this. He tried to distract himself by continuing the verification process. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he double-checked the account details and examined the signatures. Every little detail was being scrutinized with increasing intensity. Still, no red flags were popping up, and yet the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. The woman didn't speak. She simply stood there, watching him. Her eyes were calm, steady, but there was an undercurrent of something more. It was as though she knew exactly what was going on in his mind. She didn't rush him. She didn't demand anything. Her silence seemed to press in on him, making him feel more and more exposed with each passing moment. He wasn't used to this, being on the other side of the power dynamic. Most people who walked into the bank were either nervous or deferential, but she was different. She wasn't worried, and that made him feel even more on edge. He tried to shake off his growing discomfort and focused on the next step of the verification process. "I'll just need a few more minutes," he said, though it was more to reassure himself than her. The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. He didn't need more time. He needed confidence, but right now, he didn't have that. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. The sound of his fingers tapping the keyboard echoed in his ears as he tried to distract himself from the gnawing feeling that something was terribly off. He could feel the woman's eyes on him, but he couldn't bring himself to look back at her. For some reason, he felt a little intimidated, though he couldn't understand why. She wasn't threatening or intimidating, not in the traditional sense. But there was something about her, something unspoken that made him feel as though he was failing at a test he didn't know he had taken. The silence between them stretched on. He continued to click away at the computer, hoping to find some kind of answer that would settle his nerves. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't ignore the nagging thought that he was missing something, something important. He couldn't help but glance back at her once more, his curiosity piqued. She hadn't moved a muscle, still standing with an air of patience that seemed almost out of place in this tense moment. Was she really just another customer? Or was there more to this encounter than he could see? For the first time, the thought crossed his mind that he might be on the verge of making a serious mistake, a mistake that would be much harder to undo than simply taking a few extra minutes to verify a check. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the bank grew heavier. The manager felt as though the weight of his actions was bearing down on him more with every passing second. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard, unsure of what to do next. The silence between him and the woman felt charged, but it was more than just a simple pause in conversation. It was as if an unspoken understanding had passed between them, one that he couldn't quite grasp. He continued to stare at the screen, his eyes flicking back and forth over the check's details, hoping that something, anything, would make sense of the growing sense of unease in his chest. He had checked everything. The routing numbers, the signatures, the account details, everything seemed in order. Still, the feeling that something was terribly wrong refused to let him go. Then, in a moment of unexpected clarity, something caught his eye. It was a small detail, one that he had missed earlier, but now it was impossible to ignore. His heart skipped a beat when he saw it, the name on the check. For a brief second, the world seemed to slow down. The name wasn't one that he recognized immediately, but it was enough to make him pause. He squinted at the letters, as if he could somehow force them to reveal their meaning. The name at the bottom of the check was familiar, but it wasn't until he fully processed it that the realization hit him. The woman standing in front of him, the one who he had assumed was just another customer, was the owner of the bank. He felt his breath catch in his throat, and his face flushed with sudden embarrassment. His mind raced as he replayed the events in his head, piecing together the moments he had missed. The calmness, the confidence in her demeanor, it all made sense now. He had been so caught up in his assumptions, so wrapped up in his doubts, that he had failed to recognize who she was. He had treated her like any other customer, not realizing that she was, in fact, the one who held the power here. The owner of the bank, the person who signed his paycheck. His heart pounded in his chest as he fought to process this new information. He had already made a mistake, and there was no way to take it back. The woman had been patient, but now he could feel her eyes on him, watching his every move with a knowing calm. How had he not recognized her earlier? How had he let his bias cloud his judgment? The weight of his error settled on his shoulders. He felt foolish, small even. The woman, whose name he had just now connected to her, hadn't made a fuss. She hadn't demanded to be treated differently. She had stood there, silent, watching as he doubted her. And now, the truth was clear. She owned the bank. She was the one who called the shots. The one whose name was on everything. The one who had built this institution from the ground up. But here he was, questioning her integrity, doubting her ability to pay a check that she had written herself. He couldn't bear to meet her eyes again, but he knew he had no choice. He had to face the consequences of his actions. His assumptions had led him astray, and now he had to deal with the fallout. As he finally looked up at her, his voice was shaky. He was too aware of his mistake to hide the embarrassment that colored his tone. He mumbled something about verifying her check once more, but the words felt hollow. He couldn't undo the wrong he had done. The manager was now fully aware of the mistake he had made. He sat there in stunned silence, staring at the woman in front of him. His heart raced, and his mind was flooded with a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. How had he missed this? How had he failed to recognize the woman who, in reality, owned the very institution where he worked? The more he thought about it, the more his face flushed with shame. He had been so caught up in his own doubts, so quick to judge, that he had missed the most important detail of all: her identity. It was a simple mistake, but one that felt like a huge failure in his eyes. The woman remained calm, her face still unreadable, but there was a slight change in her posture. She had been patient throughout the entire process, not once showing any sign of frustration. Yet now, as the manager fumbled through his thoughts, it was clear that she knew exactly what was going on. She hadn't rushed him. She hadn't interrupted. Instead, she had simply let him figure it out for himself, letting him come to the uncomfortable realization on his own. The manager finally gathered the courage to look up, meeting her eyes for the first time since his mistake became clear. His voice faltered as he spoke, a nervous attempt to apologize, to explain himself. I didn't realize," he said, his words awkward and heavy. "I didn't know who you were." There was no anger in her eyes, no sign of offense. Instead, she gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile, but it wasn't one of kindness. It was one of understanding, as if she had already known how this would play out. She didn't say anything at first, simply watching him with that same calm expression. She knew what he had done, and she knew that, for him, it wasn't an easy mistake to swallow. The manager felt small under her gaze. His face was burning now, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. How could he have been so blind? How could he have doubted someone who clearly held so much power and influence? He wanted to hide, to crawl into a hole, but instead he sat there, awkwardly waiting for the inevitable consequences of his actions. He fumbled with his papers, trying to find something to focus on other than the woman standing before him. The silence between them stretched on, and he could feel the tension building. It was as though every second that passed made his mistake more apparent. Finally, the woman broke the silence, her voice calm and steady. "It's all right," she said simply, but the words didn't offer much comfort. There was no anger, no harsh rebuke. But there was something else in her tone, something that made it clear she didn't need to raise her voice to make her point. Her patience was not an invitation for him to feel comfortable. It was a reminder that she was in control, that she was the one who had the power in this situation. The manager swallowed hard, trying to regain his composure, but it was clear that the damage had already been done. His earlier assumptions and actions had already exposed him in front of someone who should have been respected, someone who had far more influence than he could have ever imagined. He felt a deep sense of humility. He was the one who had misjudged, the one who had looked down on someone without even realizing who they were. And now he had to live with the knowledge that his actions had reflected poorly on him, in front of someone who could very easily have made this moment much more difficult for him. The woman remained calm, her eyes locked onto the manager's with an almost knowing expression. She didn't seem angry, nor did she seem surprised. It was as if she had expected this moment, perhaps even anticipated it. The manager, on the other hand, couldn't quite shake the feeling that he had just made a fool of himself. He felt exposed in a way he hadn't experienced before. Here he was, sitting across from the very person who owned the bank, and yet he had treated her like just another customer, questioning her check and making assumptions based on his own biases. His mind raced with thoughts of how to salvage the situation. He opened his mouth to apologize again, but the woman cut him off with a soft yet firm voice. "You don't need to apologize," she said calmly, her tone unhurried. "But you should learn from this." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time since the moment had started, the manager truly felt her power. She wasn't angry, she wasn't throwing around her authority, but the calmness in her voice carried an undeniable strength. It was the kind of quiet confidence that made him feel small and foolish all at once. She was in control, and somehow that felt more powerful than any outburst or reprimand could have been. The manager, still flustered, muttered something about standard procedures and needing to follow protocol. He wanted to explain himself, to justify his actions, but the words didn't come out right. They sounded hollow, almost like excuses. It was clear to him now that no explanation could erase the awkwardness of the moment. He had judged her, treated her with suspicion, and he couldn't undo it. She raised an eyebrow slightly, as if listening to his attempt at an explanation, but she didn't press him further. Instead, she simply nodded and said, "You should always approach situations like this with respect for others. You never know who they are or what they might be capable of." The manager swallowed hard, trying to hold on to whatever sense of professionalism he could muster. He hadn't expected this kind of response. He had expected anger, frustration, maybe even a stern warning. But instead, the woman was giving him a lesson, a reminder of something he should have known, but had clearly forgotten in that moment. She wasn't going to let this mistake slide, but she wasn't going to make him feel worse than he already did. Her grace in handling the situation left him speechless. She wasn't looking for an apology, nor did she seem to need one. What she wanted was for him to reflect on his actions, to recognize his error and learn from it. The manager's face flushed even more, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment alone. He felt a deep sense of humility. He had expected to deal with someone who was just another face in the crowd, but he had underestimated her in every way. This woman wasn't just any client. She was the reason the bank even existed in the first place. For a moment, he just sat there in silence, staring at his desk. The weight of the lesson hung over him, heavier than the check he had questioned. He could feel the reality of his actions sinking in. His assumptions, his quick judgment, had been completely misplaced. He had underestimated her because of her appearance, her demeanor, and perhaps even because of his own bias. And in doing so, he had exposed himself as someone who had failed to see the bigger picture. When he finally looked up, he felt a little clearer, but also more aware of the mistakes he had made. The woman stood there, still waiting for the check to be processed. But now he saw her not just as a client, but as a reminder of what he needed to learn about himself. He had missed the mark, and now he knew it. But he also knew this moment was going to change him. He didn't need to say much more. He understood what had happened. The lesson had been delivered not through words of criticism, but through the woman's calm, steady presence. He could only hope he would take it to heart. The silence in the bank felt different now. It was no longer awkward, but it was thick with an unspoken understanding between the woman and the manager. The manager had expected the worst, maybe a harsh word or a scolding, but instead he had been met with calm, composed wisdom. The woman had shown him the power of patience and dignity, and it was something he couldn't easily shake off. He still couldn't believe the mistake he had made, and the embarrassment continued to eat at him. But something in her calm presence seemed to make it clear that this was not a moment to dwell on shame. It was a moment to learn and grow. Even so, the manager still couldn't help feeling like he had let himself down. His mind replayed the interaction over and over, wondering how he could have done things differently. He had questioned her when he shouldn't have. He had let his assumptions cloud his judgment. But now, as he sat there in front of her, all he could do was try to move past it, even though he knew it would take time for him to forget this mistake. "I've processed everything," he finally said, his voice still tinged with unease, though his words were more measured now. He pushed the check across the desk to her, and for the first time, his hands weren't shaking as much. There was still a sense of discomfort, but he had managed to regain a little bit of his composure. The woman looked at the check, then back at him. Her face remained composed, her calm gaze steady, and she didn't rush to take the check. She let the moment linger for a second longer than necessary, as though she were giving him space to reflect on what had just transpired. She could have made this entire encounter uncomfortable for him. She could have demanded something from him, perhaps even embarrassed him further for his mistake. But instead, She chose to let him face his own realization. It wasn't about the check anymore. It was about what he had learned. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice still as serene as it had been throughout the entire interaction. There was no sarcasm in her tone, no edge. It was just a simple acknowledgement, but the way she said it made it clear that she had taken everything into account. She wasn't angry, she wasn't upset, but she was making it clear that the situation was over, and there was no need to make it worse by lingering on the past. The manager looked at her, surprised by the lack of confrontation. He had expected her to demand more from him, maybe even to show some frustration, but instead, she had responded with grace and poise. It was a contrast to what he had been used to. Most people would have demanded an apology, or at least some sign of remorse. But she hadn't done that. She had given him something far more valuable, a lesson in respect and self-awareness. He nodded, finally managing to find his words. "I'm sorry again," he said quietly, though his voice wasn't as shaky as before. It wasn't much, but it was all he could offer. He had learned from his mistake, and he hoped she knew that he understood the gravity of what he had done. She gave a brief nod of acknowledgement, but didn't say anything more. Her silence was as powerful as her words had been earlier. The lesson had been imparted, and now it was time for both of them to move on. The manager sat back in his chair as she left, the door closing softly behind her. He didn't feel the immediate rush of relief he had expected, nor did he feel as though he had escaped unscathed. He felt something deeper, something that stayed with him as he sat there alone. He had learned something about himself today, something that would stay with him for much longer than the memory of this single interaction. And as he thought about it, he couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. He had been given the chance to grow, to correct his assumptions, and to be more aware of how his actions affected others. As the manager sat there in the quiet of the bank, he couldn't help but reflect on the unexpected turn of events. The woman had left without a word of anger, without a scolding or reprimand. She had simply gone about her business, leaving him with a deep sense of realization. In the moments after she left, he found himself thinking more about his own actions than the check or the transaction itself. The mistake he had made was clear now, and the weight of it hung over him, not in a crushing way, but as a gentle reminder of how assumptions could cloud judgment. He glanced around the bank, as though seeing it in a new light. The polished floors, the gleaming counters, the sleek, professional design. It all seemed so different now. The place that had once felt like a mere workspace suddenly felt more significant. It was a space built by people, and now, with the knowledge that the woman had founded it, it felt as if he had been in the presence of greatness without even knowing it. Her calmness, her poise, her quiet power. He now understood what he had failed to recognize earlier. She wasn't just any client. She was the very heart of the institution. He couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than just about the transaction. It was about respect. It was about learning to see others for who they truly were, not who he assumed them to be. His own biases had been exposed, and while the experience was humbling, it was also a valuable lesson. He now understood that people were far more than what they appeared to be on the surface, and those assumptions could cost him more than just an apology. They could cost him the opportunity to learn and grow. As the day went on, the manager continued with his work, but the memory of the encounter lingered. He couldn't forget the way she had handled everything so gracefully. She had been firm, yet understanding. She had given him a chance to realize his error without ever raising her voice. That kind of wisdom, that quiet strength, was something he could only hope to emulate in the future. Later that day, a colleague walked by his desk, asking if he had seen the news. The manager nodded absent-mindedly, still processing everything that had happened. His colleague mentioned something about the owner of the bank, a successful entrepreneur who had built an empire from the ground up. The manager's heart sank. He realized then that the woman he had served earlier that day wasn't just an influential figure. She was the very reason the bank existed. She had been patient with him, despite his flaws, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for her. She hadn't just been a client. She had been the one who had created the opportunity for him to work at the bank in the first place. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but the lesson he had learned stayed with him. It wasn't just about checking the facts. It was about seeing the person behind the details, acknowledging their worth, and treating them with the respect they deserved. He knew that moving forward, he would never forget the woman who had changed the way he viewed his job and his interactions with others. And though the encounter had been brief, it had left a lasting impact. When he left work that evening, he walked out into the world with a different perspective. The lessons from that day, the importance of humility, respect, and seeing beyond the surface, were ones he would carry with him for a long time. And though he didn't expect to see the woman again, he would never forget her presence or the way she had taught him a valuable lesson with nothing more than her silence and grace.